I think one of the questions that sometimes comes up is what motivates us to do what we do, and I suppose we can all think of some moment that perhaps was a bit of a transition moment in a way. I know for me it came when I was in Moldova some years ago. Up until then I'd been doing work on preventive mechanisms and torture prevention that was really rather, well, theoretical in the sense that that's what it was. But with an NGO, I was involved in an event, and it was suggested we went out to and we visited the central prison. And I suppose I'd seen things like it in the past, but never in such starkness. To see, to go into cells which people were being held in remand for years at a time, never being let out except for maybe barely an hour a day, completely pitch black inside because of shutters, you know, on the window, and no sanitary facilities, no lighting, just dark pits in which, and you thought, you know, this is the sort of thing you thought only existed in medieval horror stories, and then you're seeing it in front of you, and you're seeing it and you're smelling it and you're feeling it, and you think, well, actually the sort of thing that we're doing is designed to have an impact on things like that. And we know it does. It doesn't do what we would want to do, which is to get rid of it all, but it does help. And I suppose it's tracing it back to some of those moments which are, shall we say, less cerebral and a little bit more, shall we say, emotional, sometimes reminds you of what it is that you're really all about. And certainly to me, that was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that.
I think for me, when I first became involved with human rights, it was in relation to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and I would go to their meetings, which were all over the continent, on a fairly regular basis, and you'd meet some very inspirational individuals. At that stage, people coming from Nigeria in particular made huge efforts to simply get to the meetings wherever they were. Often were arrested en route, arrested on the way back, detained and so on, and extremely inspirational in terms of the trouble they got through just to get to these meetings so that they could say publicly what was happening in their country. And I think that for me was quite important in terms of these mechanisms are important, and people do see the need for them, and although human rights is often difficult to show impact of one particular activity or event, it's a chipping away process, and the little things that you can do can make a difference.
Yeah, I guess my background prior to Bristol was working for NGOs, so I worked with NGOs for about 10 years. And quite often with NGOs, I think it's very difficult to sit down and have a constructive dialogue with governments. It's incredibly hard to do that because you're in a position of naming and shaming quite often. And there is a definite role that needs to be played with that, whereas you have much more, I think, freedom, certainly within something like the centre, to be able to be engaging with all the different actors that you need to do. And for me, I found that quite liberating as someone who's, I guess, consider themselves to be a human rights activist, that you can do that within an academic environment.
But sometimes motivation for me is about very tiny little step that my work has been able to achieve, at least tiny little step in the perspective of the rest of the world. And what I'm referring to is specifically when I'm thinking in the past year, I've done quite a lot of work in Turkmenistan in relation to the obligations the country undertook under the Convention Against Torture. The country, one of the key obligations is that within the year of ratification it's supposed to submit its report to the Committee Against Torture. Turkmenistan had failed to do so for 9 years. There was no report, no communication with the Committee Against Torture whatsoever. And then with a sort of shift in the government, there was a decision made that we're going to submit the report. And when the report was submitted, I was asked to come in the country and to assist them in preparing for a dialogue which was forthcoming in Geneva. So far, Turkmenistan had done in relation to other treaties is that when going to Geneva, they would send a diplomat. And one person who, with all due respect, doesn't know the intricacies of the implementation of the Convention Against Torture, which Turkmenistan was considered in May this year. They had a full-blown delegation with actual practitioners on the board. It was one of the first recommendations I made in my first report, and I'm not going to say I achieved it. And for the rest of the world, it probably seems a tiny little step, so what, they sent a full delegation. But it was the first time that Turkmenistan had actually done that, and done that for such a complicated country. And for me, there was that sense of, well, I'm not claiming that situation in Turkmenistan is perfect in relation to Convention Against Torture, but there's a tiny step taken towards it. And that's something that makes me feel good.